Okay, I think we're good to get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Erin. I'm a program manager for the Association for Independence in Radio, a nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting the work of independent journalists, reporters, including underrepresented voices in media. AIR offers training, mentorship, resources, and community to a wide variety of audio professionals. To find out more, please visit airmedia.org. Today's presentation will be recorded and made available for the public within a few days of the presentation at soundpath.co. I'm going to drop some links in the chat and be dropping some resources there for you throughout. If you would like to learn more about AIR and the work that we do, I'm going to drop a link to subscribe to our industry newsletter, where you can find out more about our programming, such as collaborations like this panel today. And if you are an audio professional, I would also urge you to take our community survey. This is your chance to tell the Association of Independence in Radio exactly what we should be focused on going into 2024. Again, I'm Erin. I'm going to help you in the chat today, sharing some resources. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jeremy Helton.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Helton, a podcast audience development consultant and the coordinator of the Archives to Earbuds discussion series. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us, and I'd also like to thank the Leo Baeck Institute and AIR, Association of Independence in Radio, for making this event possible. Throughout the Archives to Earbuds series, we've talked about cultural institutions, educators, and audio producers working together to bring existing analog and digital media to life through podcasting. But oftentimes podcasts end up becoming more than just a means of transmitting the content of an existing archive or collection. They end up adding to the archives, or in some cases, they become archives in and of themselves. Our panelists today are here to share their experiences with collection, curation, production, and preservation. So without further ado, our moderator is Ben Nadaff-Hafrey. Ben writes and hosts The Last Archive, a podcast he helped create with historian Jill Lepore to examine the history of truth and the historical context for our current fake news post-truth moment. He's also a musician and has written scores for BBC Radio, a Pushkin Industries audiobook, and documentary film. Bill Healy is a journalist in Chicago. He produced You Didn't See Nothin, winner of the 2023 award for Best Serialized Story from the Third Coast Audio Festival, and Somebody, an investigative podcast that was a finalist for the 2021 Pulitzer Prize in Audio Reporting. He is currently working on 2 upcoming podcasts, one about parole and another building on the work of his hero, Studs Terkel. Bill teaches documentary radio at Northwestern University. Dana Gerber-Margie is a founder of Bellow Collective, the beloved podcast newsletter, and co-editor until 2020. Collaborating with a team of archivists, she co-led the Andrew W. Mellon-funded project Preserve This Podcast from 2018 to 2020. The project aimed to educate and provide resources for podcasters for the long-term preservation of their content. And some of those resources will be shared in the chat during this panel discussion, so be on the lookout for those links. Dana was an audio archivist at the Wisconsin Historical Society and with Recollection Wisconsin, and she is currently the documentation lead for the University of Wisconsin-Madison IT Help Desk, but still listens to podcasts daily. Natalia Petrzela is a historian of contemporary American politics and culture. She is an associate professor of history at the New School and the author of Classroom Wars, Language, Sex, and the Making of Modern Political Culture, and Fit Nation, The Gains and Pains of America's Exercise Obsession. She is co-producer and host of the acclaimed podcast, Welcome to Your Fantasy, and the co-host of the Past Present podcast. And last but not least, Renate Evers has served as the Bruno and Suzanne Scheidt Director of Collections at the Leo Baeck Institute since 2016, coordinating the work of LBI's 3 collections departments, Archives, Art, and Library. She holds a master's in legal studies and degree in management information systems from German universities, a master's of computer information systems from Rutgers University, and a master of arts in Jewish studies from Columbia University. She has worked in various capacities in special collections, archives, and university libraries, building and preserving physical and digital collections. Ben, Bill, Dana, Natalia, and Renate, thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you so much for putting this together, Jeremy. It's such a fun topic to discuss. So we're going to get started. I think today we're going to look at the role of archives across the entire life cycle of a podcast. So beginning with how you create a podcast from archival materials to what you then do with a podcast once it's made, how you preserve it in the archives. But to start, I just want to do a quick lightning round. This is the celebration of archives. I would love to hear from you guys about how you came to archival work and what your relationship with archives is. And Natalia, maybe you could start us off.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And thank you so much for including me in this panel and everyone for being here. So, as a historian who really comes from like archivally based books, I don't even know when my romance with archives really first started. I loved always looking at old stuff. And so I would say, in terms of podcasting, that there wasn't anything that different in terms of thinking about how I craft a story, that what I do is I go to the primary sources of the topic that I'm interested in, and then I take it from there. And so I think for me, like the getting from writing books based on archives to podcasting through archival materials, one of the things that was really different in part is what I was working on was about like male strippers, was going from like established professionally held and curated collections to like making our own archives. So that's just like a little teaser of various ways that I interact with archives. But to me, that is research. It's archival. It's about original sources, whether it's on the page or in our ears.
Totally. Dana, do you want to go next?
I sure do. Hi, everyone. I'm Dana. I actually took an aptitude test in high school that said I should be an archivist.
What do you think it was? What did you
Well,
bubble in that was like that connected you with archives? You're like,
I have no idea. I think it was something that I was like the friend that took pictures and collected things like from the plays that we went to. And the description I remember of it was that an archivist is someone who, if an alien came to Earth, they would help to explain the history of the world. And I was like, that sounds awesome. I love the X-Files.
yeah, they're baiting the hook with that one. Like aliens.
Yeah,
I
so
don't know.
So I went to UC Berkeley, and I like from the start, I knew my plan was to then get a master's in library science. So I did history, Russian history, I worked at an archive there at the Bancroft Library, met and fell in love with my husband at the Bancroft Library. And then after the subprime mortgage crisis and all of that fun stuff in 2008, ended up to somehow got to UW-Madison and got my master's in library science, which is where I worked at the Wisconsin Historical Society. And then I actually left the archives field a little bit. I have like a toe still in there, but now I actually work in like information knowledge management. So it's kind of an adjacent kind of field.
That's awesome. Thank
But
you.
yeah, and I was an audio archivist for a while at at Wisconsin Historical Society.
They've got an incredible audio collection. I remember just happening upon that before I knew anything and being like, why is all of this stuff in Wisconsin Historical Society? It's amazing.
Well, they have a ton. Yeah, they really do. It's a really amazing collection. And I heard that they're working on their reference room. So if anyone wants to see a new remodeled room, it's supposed to be really beautiful.
Awesome. Renata, do you want to go next?
Thank you.
sure. So Erin and Jeremy, thank you again for setting this up. And Ben, thank you for the nice introduction. So I think I'm really one of the traditional librarian, archivist, information specialist, and who has worked in academic libraries, archives, special collections for years. How did I get there? Good question. I think I could not decide on a subject, right? I was interested in everything. So that's how I got into this profession. And I've worked now for quite a while for the Leo Baeck Institute. And that is a special collection and research institute dedicated to the history and culture of German Jewish history, and which was founded in 1955 in 3 branches. And here I'm representing the New York branch, and which has collected one of the largest library and archives of source and secondary material related to German Jewish history. And so in my current role, I'm overseeing these collections. So overall 13,000 archival family collections, 80,000 books, 1,600 periodical titles, a photo collection, and an art and object collection. So very traditional collection, and a team of dedicated professional librarians and archivists. And that is the key. And these are the ones who make the discoveries of stories possible. So that
That's
would be
awesome.
my introduction.
That sounds like it's an incredible collection.
Mhm.
Bill, last but not least, do you want to talk a little about your relationship with archives?
Sure. I am a journalist here in Chicago and just super passionate about getting conversations going in the public arena and like trying to invoke the past and get it in conversation with the present. And archives are like the best way to do that for this medium. I, among other things, started with WBEZ, the public radio stations there, an internship that I got because I met someone at the archive at the Chicago History Museum, and one thing led to another, and it's kind of where it began for me.
That's awesome. I mean, that what you just said about putting the past in conversation with the present, that's something that I really love about You Didn't See Nothin, the series that you produced that just came out, which details a crime that happened in the late 1990s. But it does this amazing thing where there's a lot of news reports and sort of mass media clips that are the sort of thing you would hear covering the crime in 1997 when it happened. But then you sort of situate it in an entirely new archival context, which is all this grassroots media, a lot of oral histories. There's even a scene in the podcast where the host describes getting a call from you when you're in the basement of somebody's house and you've found some crucial tape that helps break the story open or helps illustrate the story. That process of building your own archive, which is something that Natalia, you also just spoke about, and I know you interviewed 66 people from Chippendales when you did Welcome to Your Fantasy. I was wondering if you two could talk about making a sort of unorthodox archive and the life cycle of that archival material in the podcast, and then what you do with it outside the podcast. And maybe, Bill, we could start with you, and then Natalia, please, if you could both talk about it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the big coups we had while researching this podcast was the name of someone who had been filming at protests back in the 90s that were kind of pushing against the public narrative of reconciliation and healing after this hate crime that had happened. And as much as we read about these protests and saw flyers for them and stuff, we could never find footage of it. And, talking about it is one thing. That's important to talk about it, but to hear it and to be there is just a whole other level. And so we kept pushing and trying to find the footage. And it wasn't until like about a week or two before we were going to finalize the episodes that we found this we finally found it was a shoebox that had the VHS cassettes that were amongst this guy's. It was all covered in dust. He had died 5 years earlier. His wife had left his office as it was, and we talked our way into the room and got it digitized and quickly ingested it and incorporated it and really pivoted on one of the episodes. But I forget your question, but there's like a benefit to something that happened in 1997 in that there were people out there with cameras, microphones, and all that stuff was available, but it's also not digitized. And so bringing it into the digital era for the first time, it feels exciting, it feels new, it feels like something that people hadn't heard before. And I could continue talking.
No, right. I mean, 26 years, it doesn't sound like that long ago, but there's this vividness. It sounds like the 90s, which, I mean, and similarly, the Chippendale stuff really sounds like the 80s in this incredible way.
Yeah, thank you. And I can't wait to listen to your podcast. That sounds, I want to hear the 90s. But Totally. I think, we really brought together for the Chippendales podcast, like, lots of ephemera, to use the official term, that people just had like under their beds or had in a pile of VHS tapes that they'd never gotten around to getting digitized. And I think, like, stepping back for a second, I'm always interested in the kind of historical stories that I tell in kind of voices that are like sort of marginalized and probably aren't thought of as that important to be, documented or accessioned into a conventional archive. And so that's really interesting because there's this like detective process to it, but it's also really hard because I end up like, finding a lady on Facebook who has the same name as the manager of Chippendales and calling her. And then, we obviously do an interview with her, but kind of looking around her house and seeing what do you
magenta
have here?
house.
I'm glad that stuck with you. And so, the process for Chippendales really was, in a lot of ways, like absolutely pulling down everything we could from existing material, which wasn't honestly that hard to get. Like, there's a lot of Chippendales stuff out there, but I think what's interesting about that is that, like, because there's so many shows that are online and, talk show appearances and all that, there's been quite a lot of media that covers this phenomenon. And they're probably, my sense is that people, either because of their constraints or they have different questions that they were asking than us, were like, well, there's a lot out here that's pretty easily available. We'll use that. That's enough. And it is kind of enough. But we were interested in kind of this like deeper story. And so that led us beyond those materials to get a lot of personal items, to go into sort of unconventional places, law enforcement records, obviously interviewing a lot of people as well. And ultimately what we have is an archive now, like the only Chippendales archive, as far as I know. And so we just like have it on Google Drive. And so the question is like, how might we make that available to other people who might want to research this? And I'm totally, we started some conversations with one archive that does like history of sexuality, but I think like COVID happened or something and we didn't get very far, but it is a real question because podcasts are often made by private companies. It's a very different project than when you're doing oral history to, go to a public archive to be preserved there. So, yeah.
Yeah, because I think some of the value, I mean, both shows are just incredible stories and extremely well told, but some of the value of both Welcome to Your Fantasy and You Didn't See Nothin is that they're driving a wedge that's substantially expanding a mainstream conversation that was happening around both events. And you can hear how important the new archival material is in recontextualizing the central storyline. And so the idea that would not then become part of a mainstream understanding or permanent collections related to these incidents is sort of scary. I mean, like it seems really important to preserve both in the podcast form, but also in a collection.
Yeah, there's so much more obviously than made it into the show itself. I mean, hours and hours and hours. And yeah, it does. It feels ephemeral in a way that I don't want it to be. And I think you're absolutely right.
Well, so that there's that one model of making a show out of archival materials, just the build your own archive. Then there's the show that draws on and sits on top of institutional archives, like Leo Beck Institute's show Exile, which is an incredible show hosted by Mandy Patinkin, that has these sort of gems of stories that are pulled from these thousands of family collections we have. I was wondering, Renate, if you could talk a little bit about the process of finding those gems and assembling the story out of the archive.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So it was not a grassroots effort, but LBI is very new to the podcast scene, I have to say. And it's thanks to the vision of a philanthropist behind the scenes who is dedicated to our mission. And LBI was thus in a position to release the first podcast series at the end of 22-23, and I mean, as the title Exile, and features 12 narratives connected to our collections, library, archives, stories in the collection. So we did not use existing oral history files. But we distilled the stories out of archival material and then created 30-45 minutes voiceover narratives based on our collection, tightly scripted and produced through Antica Productions, this Toronto-based production studio that produces nonfiction podcasts, films, and series. And they did all the heavy lifting together with our director of public history, David Brown, and his team. And the episodes were narrated by Mandy Patinkin, literally and de facto an excellent voice and an ambassador for the stories, and then enriched with short interview clips of relatives or historians or people connected to the stories. And so can either be found via our website or via the platforms Apple Podcasts or Spotify's. And we learned in the last series about different podcast categories. And I think that's also very important to keep in mind. So Stuart Cox came up with some type of a classification. So what we have been embarking on totally innocently is this nonfiction narrative podcast, which he called HBO Premium, a stage adaptation for an audience.
What were the other classifications? I'm so curious.
Yeah, the other classifications. One second, I have them here. One moment.
Were they all named after streamers or
no? I mean, he had the chat casts. That's basically something to start with. And then this narrative nonfiction. Then he had this category of fiction and live events, and then single voice conversations. Now, so obviously we hit immediately on the most expensive and most difficult part. Okay, we did, and it was an overwhelming success. And we had right away more than 100,000 listeners, and 80% of the listeners stayed on, which is probably a small feat. And then a few days ago, Antika and LBI were awarded the Signal Awards in a few categories. So obviously we had all the parameters in place, the what, the who, the why, and the how, and we didn't even know that we did, and somehow it worked out. And this success translated into a grant for a second series that is so it's currently being launched, and a third series which will be dropped in 2024. And there will be also a German version, since we have a branch in Berlin, and launched at the end of the year. So let me just describe where we are coming from, and that's probably also a reason why this worked. So the LBI New York is a mid-sized nonprofit organization. We have about 19 full-time employees, of which half work in collections, so the librarians and archivists, and half in administration, events, exhibition, fundraising, with some staff members overlapping. Collection and preservation, conservation, and access to materials has been and still remains the core task of the Institute. But in recent years, the communication of historical content has increasingly become the focus of our work, under the keyword public history. And this can range from programs that present history in context, usually lectures and exhibitions, and to the newest approach, storytelling. And this is also no coincidence, since, I mean, the Institute was founded because in the 1950s, there was one of the largest German-speaking Jewish immigrant communities in New York and also in other locations. But that's why the New York Institute was founded. And so it's rooted in the Holocaust, rooted in the Shoah, the immigrant experience. But it took on also its own life. However, this generation of witnesses of the Holocaust is slowly dying out, passing away. And so we have to find new ways of connecting to new audiences and telling the story. And so the narrative of the Holocaust, the Shoah, is so overwhelming and cannot do it justice in a way with a historical approach. You don't reach an audience. It's too overwhelming. The connection to personal individual stories seems to be a better, or at the moment, an appropriate approach. Also connect to younger audience who didn't have the direct connection to the era of our parents and grandparents. And that is the connection between storytelling in the form of podcasting and the work of the archivists and librarians. And this storytelling is only possible because of the groundwork that has been done for about 70 years. Teams and generations of dedicated professional librarians and archivists make the discovery of these stories possible, from processing the material, cataloging, indexing, describing, digitization, or connecting the metadata to the digital asset. So basically, the sources are there. We only have to mine them for the stories. No? But this divide is also the divide between historiography and storytelling. So, so the narratives and memory. And that is also something which we can maybe also discuss later.
Yeah.
No, so because it launches already in another topic, which I would love to explore.
Well,
Okay.
so why don't we talk about that a little bit now? I mean, the difference between doing an interview for a podcast for the purposes of storytelling and doing an interview for the purposes of an archival collection, an oral history or something like that. I mean, do any of you want to talk about the difference between those two modes of interviewing and the historical value of each?
I mean, I could say just very quickly, one thing that I found that was so different is when you're doing an oral history, like very much the ethos is sort of removing the interviewer from the interaction. And you really sort of want to be, you know, a foil or just like a quiet enabler for the person to tell their story. Of course, there's a version of that too when you're doing a podcast, but certainly when we were doing Welcome to Your Fantasy, I think one of the strengths of it is like, it was conversational and I had a rapport with these people and you heard the back and forth. I wasn't just this like dispassionate vessel for them to speak.
Right.
And like that entertainment factor, right? But I actually think more substantively like that, because I don't want to say that the interviewing one does for podcasting is somehow less serious than what one does in this traditional oral history register. I actually think in that case, that rapport was pretty fundamental to the quality of the stories that I was able to elicit. And so it's a fine line. You don't want to like ham it up too much. And, you know, but and of course, even when you're doing a traditional oral history, your identity is never completely, you know, outside of the picture there. But I do think there is a different kind of register that one operates in when the idea is like, you're the host, not a historian who will eventually pull a quote from this or leave this transcript in an archive. Yeah,
you don't want to do the most sober Chippendales interview in the world. Just not, you wouldn't invite any of the good stuff.
Totally.
Dana, I saw you nodding. Do you have something to say to that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, so I listened to a lot of oral histories as I digitized them at WHS, and then for Recollection Wisconsin, I actually was kind of a collector of the oral histories then to create a project, like a web project that was focused on Wisconsin at war in general. So it was interesting because a lot of those oral histories are created and almost expected not to be heard. Like it's kind of like this, they're created and then they sit, especially when I was going around the smaller libraries and institutions around Wisconsin. And, you know, in Wisconsin, it's mainly like Madison and Milwaukee are the big cities, but there's still a ton up north. And these people just didn't ever expect, I think, for their collections to be wanted. So there was a lot more too, I think, of relationship building, that it wasn't like the big Madison, because Madison is so big. You know, the big Madison, like city folk coming and taking our stuff, especially when we were talking to Native American tribes that had some collections collected. They didn't just want to have things taken from them to be used. So there was a lot more relationship building there that wasn't about telling a story as much, I think, as like doing your material right by saving it correctly, you know, kind of like keeping it safe, keeping it from going into obsolescence. So it's really interesting, I think, too, because in podcasts, I think a lot of the times when you're interviewing, you're doing it for a certain subject, a certain, like, this is where this story is going to go. In an oral history, it is pretty rare that you have we just do the whole part of your life. We're not collecting in a certain subject. I mean, a lot of oral histories are collected. You know, we want to talk about your experience in the 1960s, like the civil rights. You know, we want to know your whole story, but we also really are here to talk about your time in the march or something like that. So they're still around a subject. But I do wonder from the person who's providing the oral history, if there's a much different experience in knowing that you're saying this to this oral historian and it'll be captured and cataloged and put into an archive for history versus this will be captured, cataloged perhaps, and put into a podcast or a story that will be published in my lifetime. So what am I going to say for how the ramifications of what I'll say now versus ramifications for my story to be heard 100 years from now? I don't know what that feels like. So I wonder, I would imagine that is a very different experience, even though a lot of the motions you're going through are roughly the same.
Well, Bill, I wonder, I mean, the work that you've done, you know, A Crime in 1997, it straddles those two things. These were recordings made that are being aired on a podcast during people's lifetimes, but they were not necessarily made by those people with the intention of being heard later. Some of the stuff that Johan's collected. How did you navigate that ethically, and how did you reach back out to people? I mean, what was the process of incorporating that into the podcast?
Yeah, well, some of the people have passed away since 1997, but there's always like rights and permissions issues that you're going to run into working with the archives. And yeah, navigating that stuff is tricky, especially if you're going to be critical with the material that you're pulling out of the archives. And we had archival material from both sides of this kind of, not a debate, but both sides of this issue. And, you know, we had archival from this pastor who was kind of enabling this narrative of reconciliation and healing after this hate crime. And then archival from these activists who were pushing back against that. And, you know, in some ways, we found in one of the sermons, the pastor, they're amplifying it out onto the street, his sermon. And so you can see the activists outside in their video, and you can hear the speaker from inside, and you can hear what exactly the same moment where he's giving his sermon and what's happening outside. And I think just putting those two up against each other does a lot.
Yeah, it's an incredible moment.
Yeah, but yeah, trying to be fulsome in the research and trying to add as much context and as much yeah, like narrative detail that we can provide from these things. I do think in terms of what Dana, you were saying, like part of the benefit to me of archival audio and part of what makes it so special is that people were, before cell phone cameras are so omnipresent, people were less self-aware and less guarded and freer.
Yeah, very much so.
And that's what's fun to listen to.
They're not already performing, which is one of the things that happens when you interview someone for a podcast. They're like, well, I'm a subject, but I'm also performing in this context.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, how much can you do to retroactively go back and say, well, we're going to use this clip in this new context? I mean, some of it is just taking care as journalists and making sure that you are, you know, getting the proper permissions, proper rights, but also just thinking through what it would be. I mean, always, if it were you and this were you in this situation, would you want this? Would you feel comfortable with this?
Yeah. Well, I think something that is, once again, slightly terrifying and also exciting about the stories you guys have shared is we have these Herculean efforts going into making these things. You're pulling things out of dusty shoeboxes in offices that, you know, probably would have normally been cleared out when someone had died, not just been left alone for 5 years. These interviews with people who might pass away, these, you know, thousands of things in the archives that have been collected in spite of great historical upheaval, all of these things then turned into podcasts. And I think anyone who works in this industry now knows podcasts are wont to disappear. Basically, when they don't make a sound, they just vanish because we're entirely dependent on these third-party, often private networks and companies to support them and keep them out there. So, I mean, two sort of examples that come to mind to convey the urgency of this. A friend of mine recently was recommending a bunch of us listen to Loud, A History of Reggaeton, which is, I think, a Futuro show that had been produced for Spotify. And you can no longer find it on Spotify. And because it was exclusive and paywalled behind Spotify, it's just not available anywhere else. If you go there and try and listen to it, it says, sorry, that's not currently available. Luckily, lots of other stuff is, which is like, that's, that's the worst thing to hear in that context. And or even a show like Flatbush in Maine, an incredible show from the Brooklyn Center for History, which was, until recently available on every platform you might want to listen to podcasts, now is only available on SoundCloud and on the Brooklyn Center for History's website. These things are in danger of slipping away. And so I know, Dana, that's something that you've worked on with Preserve This podcast. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how that project came into existence and what it seeks to do to actually correct this problem.
Yeah, of course. Well, I had an example from my own life. So when I was in graduate school, I listened to a ton of podcasts. This was about 2012, 2013. And one of the things I got interested in was kind of how archives and podcasts could collaborate, I guess. So I created a podcast called Sound of the Archives. And I think it was kind of trying to do this thing where you like take stories from the archive and you put it into a podcast for people to hear. We had 10 episodes. And I'm happy to say that it's no longer available. I don't want anyone to hear it.
You're the problem.
I'm the problem. Yeah, no. I need that Taylor Swift song. But part of it, what was really noticeable to me was that I had to pay Libsyn $5 a month to keep it up. And once I was completely poor and broke and could no longer afford the $5, I took it down. And then it was not available from anywhere. So that interested me, that it seemed like it was ubiquitous because I could just say, oh, just put the podcast into any of your podcatchers and you'll find it. But all of it's connected to the RSS feed, which is connected to where you host. So if you take it down, or if you just have, maybe it's not this like the small shop where I was paying $5 a month, but if it's a company or a group that puts it up and then they go out of business, like they no longer pay their fee, it's gone. So that was interesting to me from that perspective. And I think as I was working on Bellow Collective, this is how I pivoted. Instead of creating a podcast that none of you want to hear. Not good. Instead of creating a podcast, I kind of somehow got into this like podcast journalism. It was completely happenstance, I think. But through that, I would talk to podcasters about their work, and then I would ask just kind of on the side, like, what do you do for preservation? Just curious, like, where are you saving this? And everyone was like, oh, don't talk to me about that. They're all like, it's on Google Drive and I hope they never raise their prices. And it's a mess everywhere. So that was probably like 2016-ish. And that's when I met Mary Kidd, and who was supposed to be on this panel. So hope Mary, just like hope you're feeling okay. But I met Mary and we met at, oh my gosh, Radio Preservation Conference in Washington, D.C. And it was there too that we started both talking to each other of like, well, what are these people doing for podcasts that are on the radio right now? And no one was talking about that. And it was through my relationship to Mary. And then Mary met a woman named Molly Schwartz, who worked at Metro in New York City, and she was able to basically host a grant for us. We worked on the grant in 2017, got the grant in 2018. I have the major like thing out of the grant was these zines So honestly, if anybody wants a zine, just message me privately. We have a ton left over. When we had some extra money in the funds, we just went and bought like another massive box of them. So they're free. And what Preserve This Podcast would do is go around to different podcasting hubs to talk to indie podcasters, to just put the thought in their mind, as you're creating this work, please think about long term. And so that's what a lot of the zine is. It also is available. If you didn't want a paper one, it's available online.
I think we're going to circulate a link to it actually also.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, if anyone wants some physical copies, I have 2 huge boxes in my basement.
I'm gonna hit you up for a physical copy.
Yeah.
Well, that is one question I had is like,
yeah.
I mean, physical media lasts longer than digital media. I mean, to what extent do you feel we should be making vinyl records of our podcasts? I mean, like, how should we be preserving our podcasts?
Oh gosh, I've never, I guess, really thought of giving that as advice, because I think partly what is so important to long-term preservation is also sustainability. And if it's not a sustainable process that you as an independent podcaster can manage, if you're just like, sorry, my cat is scratching at the door. This is the problem of doing something from home. But if it wouldn't be really sustainable for a podcaster to, make all of their raw interview files, put them to a cassette tape, and then where are you going to keep those cassette tapes? So Mary Kidd was the one who I think had one of the best kind of sustainable projects, was just like every 6 months, she would move all of her files, copy them all to a hard drive. And then she lives in New York City. Her mother lived in Oregon, and she would physically mail that hard drive to Oregon in case New York City ever had another Hurricane Sandy, say, because you actually physically want to remove the file somewhere else. And then there's like easy hard drive copiers, so that hard drives can fail after about 5 years. So you can just get like a hard drive copier and take your hard drive and copy it to a new one, a more updated one. I think that's much more sustainable long term for these indie podcasters than you would find putting it to vinyl or pressing it to digital.
I just want somebody to give me license.
Pressing it to cassette, I mean. Sorry, what was that?
I just want somebody to give me license to do that. But
okay, you should totally do that if you think you would find it sustainable.
I think I'd find it.
The other thing that I have also thought of is that especially for these when we were going to these indie places, it was like podcasts that would be like about Denver or about a neighborhood in Denver, very localized ones. I really wonder if there's a relationship there, that if you're a podcaster who is in maybe not in Boston or New York City, but you're in a more local place, talk to your librarian, talk to the local archives that you have right there. They might be interested in capturing that community history. And then you have a working relationship and you can create the content, and they want to save that information about their community. I think, go ahead.
Well, this is a question. I mean, I think that so this is podcast as cultural artifact. Part of the big question of this session is kind of like, what is a podcast? Which, like, we all know basically the answer to that. But I think that question you just raised, of when a local library preserves a podcast, what are they preserving other than the file itself? Like, this is a question for everybody. I mean, what do you think is unique about a podcast that represents something specific about this moment in time? And Renata, why don't you go first, and then Bill, I see you both have hands.
Yeah, I would also highly recommend to use existing structures to preserve, archive, right? And libraries and archives have made great strides in setting up an infrastructure to preserve digital collections, create digital collections, and move them along to the next platform. I mean, our archive, for example, has been completely digitized in 2012, and so we have been keeping it up, and we are dealing with a variety of digital formats. I mean, audio and video and image files and so on and so forth. And we have invested in together with other libraries, I mean, here at the Center for Jewish History, with other libraries and archives, in a robust digital preservation system, and basically following all the library standards and so on and so forth to capture that information. Mm-hmm. So basically, since there is no restrictions what libraries and archives are collecting if it's within their scope. And I mean, they need to be able to also collect podcasts. And we do. I mean, we did it immediately with our 12. They're just cataloged. They are part of our digital management system. And we will migrate to wherever we are migrating with our digital assets. No? So, and we have security copies in place. So that is the advantage. I mean, if you work with an existing, if you can, right, if it works legally and the contracts with these hosting platforms, that you can get copies and preserve them in a library and archival environment where, I mean, either, let's say, they have a collection profile that they're collecting exactly those local stories, or they are collecting specific topical areas. No? I would check out to find a place like that and get that on the general record so that it's preserved for mankind, so to speak, because it's a moment in time. And that's also why we are so interested in preserving that, because this is the discourse that our institute has in 2023-24, right? That is our view, and how we tell a story. This might be completely different in 10 years, and also completely different how we approach our source material, what questions we ask, and how we do it. This is not just telling the story. This is also the discourse, how our institute is engaging with its own collection and telling the story. And that is also a little bit our conflict. So we are the archivists and guardians, right, of historical records. And now we are engaging in storytelling. So there's also a little conflict and challenge there. Yeah. But I don't think it is problematic, because it's a different view and a different approach. Okay.
That's fascinating. Bill, you, and then Natalia.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't know the answer to this question. I don't think anyone does. But in terms of the archives for these past two projects that I've worked on, Somebody and You Didn't See Nothin, we've created like curriculums for high school students to be able to use the podcast in their schools like you would a novel, where you listen as a group, and there's transcripts with each of the podcast curriculums. And that seems like, yes, you can put them, you can preserve your podcast, send hard drives across the country and that, but it's like getting people to care beyond this current moment and getting people to feel invested in it and really dig into the issues that you're talking about. Feels like if somebody cares, they'll preserve it and they will keep the torch alive for the important issues that you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree so much with that. I feel like there are these two related issues that you get right to, Bill, which are like just preservation, like this thing hopefully won't go away, but also like dissemination beyond when you have your release, and people can just Google and look for it. And I moderated the first conversation in this series, and Making Gay History, Eric Marcus told a very similar story about like now he is working with the NEA to have Making Gay History be used as a curricular project that teachers are getting, not in every state, but in the states where you can teach gay history, to use in curricula. And I thought that was just phenomenal. So it's so good to hear that being said. I also just think, to Renate's point a little bit too, it's so crazy that we need to make this argument that these, very work-intensive projects should be preserved. I mean, there's the first kind of, line where even a kind of lightly produced podcast, a chat or something, like that is a valuable primary source to understand what life today is like. It is an important through which people are discussing things and getting information. But then I think when I think about the more heavily produced archival shows that everybody on here is involved in, like, in the history profession, the book still occupies this like elite status. And I'm constantly telling my historian colleagues, like, I work just as hard on making welcome to your fantasy the books that I wrote. Let me tell you, like, the layers actually in many ways of creativity and of engagement and of analysis, I don't want to say are more, but are more in certain ways because you're in multiple media. So the idea that like we would even have to make a case for a library preserving this, like, I mean, you do kind of have to do that with books sometimes, but that's considered crazy. What do you mean you're just going to let this book go out of print and be invisible? And I think we unfortunately we're in this early stage where some people think, oh yeah, this is just ephemeral, like it's fine, and I think we should strenuously resist that.
It's just as they said about radio broadcasts in like the 1930s, like, it was not a given that we would archive radio broadcasts, but now they're so vital, not only to the work we do, but just to understanding what the middle of the 20th century especially was like. I mean, it raises this other question too, putting a podcast in a library, there's no footnotes in a podcast, which is the thing I hear from a lot of academics, this question of citation and how the work itself networks and refers to other things in the library or the archive, which you can sort of do in your narration, but it's a more complicated thing. That's a whole other panel discussion, which I wish we could continue having today. But I think we're actually going to move on to audience questions now. So Jeremy, do you have any questions from the audience that you want to ask the panel?
Yes, so we have one question from Megan Lubin, who said very early on in the discussion that, and I think you guys did sort of touch on this a bit, but she said, I'd love to hear even more on this subject, how folks navigate rights permissions with archival material from a process perspective. Are you reaching out and securing permission from every archival source? Are you not airing things you don't get permission for? Does it matter how much of an archive you're using in a series, a 15-second clip versus recurring clips throughout? Great question.
Bill, I know you had raised this sort of in our earlier or pre-conversation to this. Do you want to talk a little about permissions and navigating that thicket?
I can start the conversation, but I wouldn't end with me. Yeah, we're not seeking out permission explicitly from everyone who's in the archive. That would be impossible in a lot of cases where people appear momentarily at these protests. You don't have names, you don't have, I mean, it's hard to track people down. Even where we do know people who are on camera back then, I mean, generally part of the reporting process is playing stuff back for them, like playing back what they said back then and asking them to comment on it, or relaying to them a version of what they said back then and asking them to comment on it. But in terms of explicit permission, no. And generally, I'm trying to think what other parts of this question there were.
Well, I did speak to this a little bit, Bill, from the archivist side, is usually a lot of, well, the Wisconsin Historical Society, at least, so that's my main maybe bias of where I'm coming from, but they have collection keepers, like they have hired people that go out and actually contract to bring in the collection. And then when they do that contract, that's when they work out a lot with the donation of any licensing and rights there are there. So a lot of it depends on, in an archive setting, the moment of collection. And then hopefully there's enough contact information for any follow-up questions. That is actually, though, I think one of the difficulties of a lot of digital humanity projects we have, of putting stuff online is you kind of hope that it's going to be okay. In an archival setting, one thing that's nice is that if it's an archive, putting it up, a lot of us are protected by fair use and education. So my experience was a lot of, especially when it came to history and storytelling, was to push the boundaries a little bit about copyright, but that also then you need to respect people's, if it's a very, very difficult story, and their family might not want it on, it becomes a very case by case, sometimes very rough conversation. So my professor, when I was in my master's program, he said so much of what comes down to it in podcasts is it depends. And I think that it depends. I don't know if anyone else has a bigger insight into it, but licensing is definitely very, very interesting, difficult place.
Especially if you're ever provided something where the use is contingent on approval of, the context for use, that becomes really complicated journalistically.
Yeah.
So there's certainly things like we've not used that we've collected and wish we could use.
One thing I also will mention is that on the Preserve This Podcast site, we do have an example of a guest release form template so that people who are currently capturing interviews or oral, you could use it for oral, it comes from the oral history world. If you're currently capturing stuff, you can have your guests sign a release form right away. So that template is in the resources section of Preserve This Podcast. And thank you so much, Erin, for linking to that.
We have another question that my good friend Sarah Geis is sort of helping answer in the chat, but we'll go ahead and pose it in the discussion as well. Zoe Goldman had asked if Bill, but frankly, I'd love to hear Natalia's thoughts on this too, can speak about how you create curricula. Do you work with educators or an outside contractor? Do you write them yourselves?
Yeah. Well, I'm happy to talk more about that offline too, but I have a degree in teaching and education, and so for the first podcast that we made, I still worked with another teacher on it, but yeah, we went through kind of episode by episode, what are the themes and the discussion questions. We kind of take the transcript of the podcast and identify discussion questions that kids would have, identify vocabulary, stuff like that, and then tease out what are like the big issues that this podcast brings up that are relevant to students. So yeah, I worked on it myself, worked with other educators. I think it's harder than it sounds. Like it's an easy thing to be like, well, we'll make a curriculum for it. But to do one that's good, yeah, it takes dedicated attention and time. Yeah, that everyone gets pulled in a million different directions. So you really have to want it and recognize that it's for the long-term benefit of everything. But to me, that's why we're making these podcasts, is so that young people can hear it and care about the issue. So there's a real benefit. I love to talk about it more. There's so many of these podcasts that I listen to, like the Retrievals. I don't know, that one that just came out. So many podcasts that I listen to, and it's not just entertainment, it's education. And it seems like without robust conversation, so many of the ways that I'm listening are in isolation by myself. And without a robust conversation around it to reinforce the big ideas, for people to push on the tension points, it just, loses its luster over time. It just kind of sits in the back, like a book you've read, like unless you're talking about it and engaging with it.
I can't agree more, Bill. I miss that from being in Bella Collective, where we would have these really difficult big discussions of like S-Town, things like that, of like the ethics of this or the ethics of that, or, oh, what did you learn from that? And I get it a little bit, here and there, cocktail parties, but everyone has this I listened to it on a podcast and I don't remember what this was about, blah, 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 blah. You know, and sometimes you really want you want to dig in, like you want a discussion section, you know, where you just get together and you discuss maybe not the merits of like how this was composed, you know, from a creation aspect, but what we learned.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I both teach a class called Podcasting Through History, which I teach with the senior producer, Eleanor Kagan, who I made Welcome to Your Fantasy with, which is, it's about content and history, but it's really about producing an audio story. And then I teach lots of history courses. And one thing that's really interesting is I use podcasts in both, obviously, but in the more traditional history classes, less than I might think, which I like hate myself for. And I think that that's in part because it's a very different kind of text to use pedagogically, especially if you're not working with it from like a production standpoint, like how did they get that interview, or, you know, how did they do the sound design? Like using a podcast in a traditional history class, when I do it, I both feel like, oh my God, why don't I do this all the time? Like it sinks in the material in a way, they learn the content in a way that I think is very different from like read chapter 4, and I love books, but you know, it's not totally natural if you're used to teaching with written texts or even with visual sources. And so I'm working on how to do that with those students better. And like I said, every time I do it, I'm happy I did, but it is very time consuming, which I think actually speaks to the urgency of we should create these curricula and lesson plans to be used with these you know, with podcasts that already exist, because that's a very scalable way to preserve this podcast and also to do, I think, a great pedagogical service, and also to save teachers and professors prep time, which we all want to do.
Yeah, and oftentimes that stuff begins with like convincing like a lot of high school administrations, the schools themselves, that there's value in it, that it's not just something fun. We're not just not going to read To Kill a Mockingbird. We're actually going to do something deep with this podcast. And it's also usually tied in with skills on interviewing, on close listening, on journalism, ethics, and usually students engaging in some kind of project of their own where they are the makers. And in some cases, like variations on StoryCorps style interviews is a very frequent task, where they're preserving their family's histories, adding to the archive.
Well, I think we've come to the end of our time.
Great.
You know, the thing that I love about this series is that it's just opening up a huge can of worms like every time and going down the rabbit hole. And it's also the thing that I hate about it, because these conversations are taking place for an hour and then we have to finish up. So I am really, really proud of all of the discourse that's occurring on the chat, because I think that's just enriching the conversation that's happening between our panelists and our moderator. So Aaron and Air, I want to thank you guys for managing that process. Panelists, I want to thank you guys for adding stuff to the chat incredibly and being responsive to that. And also just thank you all for participating in this conversation. You know, this year has been a really intense year in podcasting that has really focused a lot on the value of it within a sort of monetizable context or a commercial context. The spirit of this series was to really reprioritize podcasting beyond that context, and to really allow people a chance to talk about it and express their love of it outside of its ability of whether or not it can deliver an ad or not. So really grateful to everyone that's participated in this panel discussion and all 3 panel discussions. And again, to the Leo Baeck Institute, the Center for Jewish History, the Podcast Academy, and AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio, for making this series possible. Thank you all so much.